Good evening, everybody. I'm Hannah Elka Meyers, director of the Manhattan Institute's Initiative on Policing and Public Safety, and I am so honored to be hosting our first in-person New York City event tonight here in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. Most people here tonight are familiar with the events that took place in this neighborhood 30 years ago. On October 19th, 1991, Yosef Lifsh was part of a motorcade following Chabad leader Menachem Schneerson. When Lifsh ran a light to keep up, he collided with another car, and his vehicle went spinning into the sidewalk, pinning two young cousins who were children of Guyanese immigrants. One of them, Gavin Cato, died, and the other, Angela Cato, was seriously injured. Angry crowds insisted that the crash was a racially motivated attack on the black children by the Hasidic Lifsh, and started beating him up. Rumors flew around that he was drunk or on the phone, or that some other act of gross negligence had led to the crash. When, on the insistence of the police, the Jewish ambulance service took Lifsh away first, leaving the trapped kids waiting for another ambulance that left moments later, crowds interpreted this as a conscious decision to help the Jew while leaving the black kids to suffer. The streets filled with black youth throwing rocks and bottles, galvanized by shouts to go to the Jewish stretch of the neighborhood and get a Jew. And later that night, a mass of black teenagers surrounded 29-year-old Australian student Yankel Rosenbaum, stabbing him in the neck and fracturing his skull, so that he later died in the hospital. How did the violence escalate so quickly and wildly? And how did it continue for days as Jews were set upon and attacked, their homes and businesses destroyed? Even New York's African-American mayor and African-American police commissioner, David Dinkins and Lee Brown, came under attack by the crowds who shouted, "Get the cops," along with "Kill the Jews." This past year, American cities witnessed riots that destroyed buildings and burned precincts. Horrific acts of antisemitism have been mounting for the past few years, and more recently have often infiltrated protests ostensibly aimed at police. And the lens of race has never been more liberally applied as a way to explain anger and violence. As former NYPD Commissioner Ray Kelly, who was here 30 years ago as the department's first deputy, subsequently described, the police should have acted with more assertiveness more quickly. And as acclaimed journalist Ari Goldman, who was on the ground as a reporter for the New York Times, has reflected, the media, who rushed in to portray the chaos as a balanced spillover of simmering tensions between blacks and Jews, should have more accurately described the vitriolic anti-Semitism being acted out. There was an unwillingness by both law enforcement and the press to engage with the situation on the ground and to respond appropriately. Is that still the case today? My two guests have grown to the heights of their fields, each with a focus on the importance of true proactive interaction with communities as a way to genuinely understand events, respond to concerns, and gain trust. And now, before we dive into a discussion of how their firsthand experiences during the riot shaped their approach to policing and journalism, respectively, I'd like to quickly introduce them. Ray Kelly held 25 different command positions at NYPD before serving 14 years as commissioner under two non-consecutive mayors. Following the 9/11 attacks, Commissioner Kelly created the first counterterrorism division of any US municipal police force and established a real-time crime center. He also served his country in the Marine Corps, including an active combat tour in Vietnam, retiring as a colonel. Commissioner Kelly was Senior Managing Director of Global Security at Bear Stearns & Co. Inc., served as Commissioner of the U.S. Customs Service, and as Undersecretary for Enforcement at the U.S. Treasury Department. He earned a JD from St. John's University School of Law, an LLM from NYU Graduate School of Law, and an MPA from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He is a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and CEO of Guardian Group, an intelligence and security consulting firm. Thank you for being here. Ariel Goldman has taught at Columbia University's Journalism School since 1993 and directs its Scripps Howard program in religion, journalism, and spiritual life. He teaches their religion seminar, reporting, the master's project, and the course, The Journalism of Death and Dying. Before coming to Columbia, Goldman spent 20 years at the New York Times, most of it as a religion writer, but also covering New York State politics, transportation, and education. He was educated at Yeshiva University, Harvard, and Columbia, and Goldman was a visiting Fulbright professor at Harvard University in Jerusalem and a Skirball Fellow at the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies in England, and a scholar in residence at Yeshiva University's Stern College for Women. Goldman is also on the faculty of the School of the New York Times. He has served on multiple boards and is the author of The Search for God at Harvard, Being Jewish, the Spiritual and Cultural Practice of Judaism Today, and a memoir, Living a Year of Kaddish. He also contributes articles and reviews to the New York Times, the Washington Post, Salon, the New York Jewish Week, the Forward, among others. Thank you as well for being here tonight. My first question goes to you, Commissioner. You led a push following the Crown Heights riot to improve and codify NYPD's riot response strategy and tactics. As we've seen unchecked rioting around the country this year, from Minneapolis to the US Capitol to right now in Portland, what lessons were law enforcement agencies missing? Or is it inevitable that some riots will just get out of hand?
Well, let me say what the first deputy commissioner's role was in those days and is today. It is not a command position as you would think it to be in an operational sense. It only really kicks in when the police commissioner is not available, out of town. So my observations here were strictly that. I wasn't involved in the actual execution until I was asked to do that by Lee Brown. So let's skip ahead and look at what the challenges are these days with the disorder. The reality is that the departments don't practice disorder control. And for instance, the NYPD stopped doing disorder control drills for all but specialized units, task forces as we used to call them. Now they're a special SRGs, a special response group, that sort of thing. And as the department admitted after May 26th and beyond of 2020, they were surprised. They just were not prepared for it. So it is a lesson there. You have to practice what you're going to need to do, even though it may be remote. And I think this administration made a determination that, hey, we have these different commands that we put in place that will be able to respond to a disorder. But they never thought about being overwhelmed with the large numbers that we saw on the streets after May 26th. So the lesson there is you have to practice. But one thing that I observed going back 30 years ago was that it was a classic case of what the department was doing up until then, sending lots of cops to a disorder. The cops were standing around or maybe formed a skirmish line, and that was it. When I responded to that scene, when Lee Brown's car called for help, it was actually 3 days after the disorder began. And Lee Brown said to me, these are kids. Why can't the cops control them? And the reason they couldn't control them was because there was no tactic. There was no strategy. They were just standing there. And a lot of the demonstrators were 14 and 15-year-old kids who were taunting the police. So one of the aftermaths of that situation was I put together a group to develop a disorder control strategy. We put out a booklet, and it's still available. If you Google it, you can still find it on the internet. But it's one of those things that I think has to be relearned on a regular basis because, yeah, the possibility of a major disorder is remote. But when it hits, it can be catastrophic. And you look what happened in New York City. You look at the looting of Macy's and the 450 cops who were injured, and that sort of thing. So asking for a lesson, it's a long-winded way of saying practice.
And do you think changes in policing like CompStat and body cameras affect the way they should be thinking about riots and preparing for them?
I don't think particularly so. I think it's kind of policing 101. This is the type of thing you should be ready to do, but there's alwaess oppressive business. There's some other issue or some other command that you wanted to put people in. So you don't pay enough attention to it, but it is something, particularly in this day and age, that I think you have to do a lot more training in. We had what we call CRVs, critical response vehicles, coming in mostly into Manhattan from precincts. Now they have specialized units that do that. But in those sessions, we had disorder control training taking place. So anyway, it's a lesson learned.
Great. And Professor, media has changed a lot since 1991. You've written about how much power the New York Times had in framing how people understood the riots. How large a role does traditional media have in framing riots and other fraught events today, and has that framing become more responsible?
Sure, happy to deal with that. First, I just want to say how great it is to be in front of a live audience. After a year on Zoom, it's nice to see faces and that are not in little boxes. So it's nice. It's very nice to be here. Thank you, Hannah, and to the Institute for inviting me. Also nice to be back in Crown Heights. I'm walking from the subway. My friend Mati said he'd pick me up, and I said, no, I want to walk. Walking from the subway and passing President Street, where my mother grew up, and passing Crown Street, where I went to high school for 3 years. And sort of being back in the neighborhood is really nice. So I welcome the opportunity to be here. Also, there's no riot going on, so that's kind of cool. When I was here 30 years ago tonight, all hell was breaking loose. So it's nice to be here on a nice, calm, quiet night after the hurricane and after the riots. Journalism in the last 30 years is unrecognizable. It's a new world and totally flipped and totally changed. I like to think there are still some core principles that we practice and believe in and that I teach, but what happened back then, this wouldn't happen today. And I can tell you so many reasons. If there was a riot, God forbid, on the streets of Crown Heights tonight, it wouldn't be framed by one newspaper, right? Or by the 3 New York newspapers, kind of in collusion, as we did 30 years ago. We all decided it was a racial tensions had bubbled over, and there were riots in the streets between blacks and Jews. That was the framing, and that was the way that it was portrayed over the first few days. And it took someone as brave as Jimmy Breslin, the great Daily News newspaper columnist, and someone as brave as my mentor, Abe Rosenthal, to call it what it was, and to say this was antisemitism. We could talk about how that dawned on people, and even on the leaders of the Jewish community over the course of the weeks after the riots. But why it wouldn't happen today, I can give you a lot of reasons. One is because there's a 24-hour news cycle, and there are satellite trucks that go to the scene and that show you what's happening. No one could tell you what's happening. You get to see it. Cell phones are the main reason. I could tell you that, there's a fight between the two sides, and you can look at video and see that I'm wrong. So that there are so many changes in journalism, as I think in policing. We've taken the power away from a few strong news organizations and given it to the people. The people are the reporters today. We still have certain news organizations that we trust, and I value that, and I hope that continues. But you can't fool the people anymore, and you can't frame a story the way that we once were able to.
And do you think social media has, as well, just with the cell phone cameras? And Commissioner, you were intimately familiar with the neighborhood, having been a precinct commander here in Crown Heights. How did your familiarity change how you interpreted and responded to the riot? Did it play into your feelings about the importance in the long run of community policing?
Well, I don't think it was that complicated, quite frankly. I did know the area. I was a precinct commander like Inspector Haywood is. But let me tell you my interpretation of what was going on. As I say, I stayed away from the operations, although I must say I did walk around here and heard some really frightening anti-Semitic statements and cries from the crowd. But the chief in charge of the operations here were holding back. They were not committing resources. They didn't make any arrests, really, virtually any arrests at all. So I ultimately went to the commissioner and said, "Do you want me to get involved in this?" And he said yes. So the next morning, I had all the chiefs involved at 7 o'clock in the morning and asked them, what's going on here? Why are you holding on? How come? One of the issues was the mayor went to visit Gavin Cato's house. There were no cops there. And no cops on the fire escape and none on the roof. So I asked one of the chiefs, why? Too dangerous. He said, too dangerous. What do you think you get paid for? Why don't we close off the streets? Well, a lot of good people working in that area, and we didn't want to prevent them from going to work. So I think they didn't really know me. I was kind of a kid that came out of nowhere, first deputy commissioner. So they were telling me what they thought the politically correct statement was. You had an African-American mayor. You had an African-American police commissioner. You then, as of the Friday before Crown Heights riots, an African-American chief of the department. So, in my view, they were reading the political tea leaves and holding back. So it was relatively simple. This is what we want you to do. Close off the streets. We used patrol wagons to do it. We brought in 50 mounted police officers and made arrests. Now, the arrests were mostly for relatively low, disorderly conduct, that sort of thing. But in those days, you could keep people, put them in the system, and keep them overnight. Today, they'll be out in 20 minutes. So it was a different situation, but it certainly broke the back of what was going on, and that, unfortunately, it lasted a couple of days longer than it should have lasted. And I read Ari's article. I was getting calls in the office about a pogrom. This is from people in the neighborhood. It was not a one huge fist fight between both sides. It was, to a large extent, the Jewish community being assaulted here. So, in any event, it wasn't so much my knowledge of the area. It was, in fact, doing what should have been done early on.
Professor, a similar question for you. You were just speaking about how fond you are of the area and familiar. Did that change your experience of the riots, your interpretation of how it was going, and your ultimate interest in community journalism?
Yeah, very much. I also just kind of want to sketch for you what it was like when a big story broke. The New York Times had like this shotgun approach. It would send a dozen reporters out to a place. Certainly if you're covering like a plane crash or a riot or some big major event, some concert in Central Park, one person can't do that, right? So you send a whole bunch of reporters, and they all contribute to the story by being in touch with what we used to call a rewrite man, but now women do it too. And at that time, there was one byline on a story. That was the New York Times rule. Only one person could write a story. Even if 12 people contributed to it, one person would get their name on the story. It wasn't my name the first several days of the riots. It was a reporter, a very fine reporter named John Kiffner, who was a rewrite man. And I called him and gave him what I knew and what I saw. But so did 11 other reporters who were on the scene here. And there were African-American reporters. and there were Christian reporters, and there were Jewish reporters. I was the one who had the most access to the Chabad Lubavitch community because I was a religion writer and I had written about Lubavitch and this community many times. There were other stories aside from the riots because there was the big question of succession. Who would succeed Rabbi Schneerson? And people were betting on that. I bet that it was going to be someone, and no one ever did succeed Rabbi Schneerson, but that's for another forum.
Other panel.
But I was sending in news that night, and as was Felicia Lee. Now, Felicia Lee was an African-American reporter for the New York Times, and the two of us were in probably different parts, different avenues, different parts of the neighborhood, as were photographers and others. So my knowledge of the community was essential to telling the story from the perspective that I had. And I acknowledge that there are other perspectives. What I wrote in my article in the New York Jewish Week about the journalistic malfeasance that I saw was that the editors wanted to show balance when there was no real balance here. Things were out of balance.
And this is a question for both of you. The riot manifested as a violent outpouring of both anti-Semitism and anti-police sentiment. Both of these hatreds have been manifesting in physical and rhetorical abuse over the past year and beyond, both anti-Semitism and a lot of anti-police anger. Is there something that connects aggression toward Jews and toward cops?
Well, as you know, Hannah, maybe people don't know, I did a study on anti-Semitism in Europe for the last 2 years for Ronald Lauder. So I saw it up close, and it is profoundly illogical as to why there is anti-Semitism. The two reasons that have gone through centuries is the blood libel, the allegation that Jews would somehow use the blood of Christian children to cook matzahs or whatever, and that the Jews killed Christ. It sounds crazy, but those are the two consistent reasons. And obviously, it makes no sense. But to show you that that notion is still around, in the Poway Shabbat attack in 2019, April 2019, the person who did it, his name was John Ernest, 19 years old. He goes into the Shabbat house. He has a AR-15 rifle. He shoots. He kills one person, and he shoots the rabbi, and the rabbi loses his thumb. And then the gun jams. He leaves. It turns out that just a few days before, he wrote a manifesto as to why he did this. In the manifesto, he pays ode to Simon, who in the city of Trent was supposedly killed in 450 CE by the Jews to use his blood. And supposedly 8 Jewish men were set on fire as a result. But here's somebody writing this in 2019. It's bizarre. But as far as anti-police feeling is concerned, rightly or wrongly, people think there's a reason for it. You know, that there's the brutality, or the police are heavy-handed, what have you. I mean, I would argue with all of those things. But, no question about it that the death of George Floyd was a horrific event and probably set policing back 20, 30 years. But I think that's the difference. It struck me as why are people anti-Semitic in Europe, and they could not give you a reason other than perhaps jealousy, but not those two reasons that have gone through history. So It makes no sense.
Right. So anti-Semitism tends to be so illogical, and anti-police sentiment tends to be falsely based. It has a logic,
Exactly.
even if it's faulty.
Yeah.
Professor?
It's a great question. Was thinking about it on my way here because Hannah did tell us she was going to ask this one. And I think both Jews and the police are admired and feared at the same time. I think there's a fear, and on the one hand, that they can have power over you, but they're also admired for what they stand for what they've accomplished. That's one thought I had, and the other, both might seem to people who don't have power that they're privileged, that they get away with things, they get to do things that others don't.
Right.
I'm not saying these are logical reasons, but when I think about what police and Jews have in common, I think those are two things.
It's very interesting. Also for both of you, professional agitators, such as Al Sharpton, came into Crown Heights following the initial car crash, augmenting the narrative of the diamond dealer Jews oppressing their black neighbors and drawing outside agitators into the area, and ultimately inciting a lot of the violence. In the end, are the messages of politicians and activists more galvanizing than anything the press or police can control?
Well, certainly we saw that on January 6th, the power of a politician to rile up people and his supporters, whip them into a frenzy against all logic and all fact. So yes, and I think that's more powerful than the press, and sadly more powerful than the truth. The truth has been devalued, and we're in an era when demagogues have power over people that exceeds the media.
I disagree. I think the media is the filter through which all information passes pretty much these days. And you have advocates who may represent a very small number of people, but they're given the forum by the press. And let's face it, in your example that you gave,
Don't blame the messenger.
30 years ago, the press was forming. They had a template, and you had to fill in that template with the facts. Otherwise, they didn't accept it. Well, it's even more so today. The press is so important, and I think they definitely massage the message, depending on their own political outlook or whatever. I mean, you had, in the New York Times, you had Beckett, the editor, basically give the word to the writers just before the 2016 election. Go and do whatever you want. This Trump is so bad that you can write basically anything you want. I mean, it was an incredible thing to do. I'd love to hear what the Columbia School of Journalism might say about that position on the part of America's newspaper of record.
Well, I won't speak for the whole university, but I will say that Trump was banned from Facebook and Twitter, not because of the press. Because he had a way around the press. He had a way to get directly to the people. So I think I don't think we should blame the press. I think there are demagogues that are reaching around the press and beyond the press and have a direct channel to them now. And I don't think the press is shaping the story.
Oh, okay, we differ, but I think they're shaping it more today than ever before. It all depends on access. There's only so many hours in a day, 24-hour news cycle. So we're going to
There's time for every opinion
this subject,
and there's a channel for every opinion.
We're going to stress it, as opposed to this subject, which we won't treat at all, or we'll minimize. I mean, that's the reality of the world we live in today.
Well, I feel like this does draw up a lot of the things that we're all talking about and discussing and trying to figure out, with the hopes that all the dialogue becomes a little more rational, a little more even, a little more true to what's happening. Commissioner.
I'm not defending Trump. I'm just saying
No,
that,
no, no.
this
I
individual
understand.
running for president was picked out by the editor of the most important newspaper probably in the world and said, go get him, guys.
Yeah, that's Commissioner. Take it back more easily to just a riot. You've spent the last few years, as you said, traveling around Europe, speaking to government, community, law enforcement leaders about anti-Semitism and security. How often do you think back on the riot as a touch point that you lived through, and how much does it inform your sense of the real seriousness and vehemence of anti-Semitism?
Well, as a result of my experiences in Europe, I saw anti-Semitism up close. I didn't have to think back this far. I was in Sarcelles, which was a suburb of Paris, when a young Jewish girl in a school uniform was slashed. Her face was slashed. There were other examples of that when I was in Europe, particularly in France. And by the way, I think that's where Jews are most at risk these days. We, myself and my team, examine 11 countries. And it varies, no question about it. Anti-Semitism in Europe is different in virtually every country. But I did see it up close. You know, Aliyah is, sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down. But if you look at Aliyah being people leaving their countries to go to Israel for religious reasons, but if you look at the trend, the population is going down. The Jewish population in Europe is going down, and I think take a mega view that it's going to be significantly less in, let's say, 20, 30 years than it is now. So, yeah, I've seen it. It's greater, by the way, in my judgment, in Europe than it is here, because it's more. For instance, hate speech in Europe is against the law. Yet you have demonstrations, you have people with all sorts of anti-Semitic statements on T-shirts, effigies of Hitler being carried in the parade against, making statements against Jews. So it's much more obvious there than it is here. That was my experience.
Great. Professor, you've spent decades reporting on religion and teaching others how to report on religion. Does the media have a problem with accuracy when it comes to anti-Semitism and Jews as opposed to other faiths and peoples? And if so, how does that manifest?
The media has a problem with religion. It doesn't get it right, whether it's writing about Jews or Muslims or Christians. It often gets the story wrong. And that's just because so many journalists are religiously illiterate. They don't know the difference between a Catholic and a Protestant, or between a Shia and a Sunni, or between an Orthodox Jew and a Reform Jew. So there is a problem in terms of knowledge on the part of journalists. It's particularly bad, I would say, with a lot of Jewish stories. And I think, to get to the heart of your question, it's very hard for some news organizations to recognize anti-Semitism. And I'll go back to my newspaper, because I won't defend it all the time, Ray. I see the New York Times as a flawed instrument, but it is a great newspaper. It makes mistakes, and it can do a much better job. With the Crown Heights riots, it didn't see that it was anti-Semitism, or it didn't want to acknowledge that. And as a newspaper that was founded by a Jewish family, at least in its current incarnation, it's very self-conscious about its Jewish roots. And this is an important part of history that during the Holocaust, the New York Times underplayed the story and missed the story. And a lot of people say it did it purposefully, because it didn't want to draw attention to Jews and Jewish issues and didn't want to be seen as a Jewish newspaper. And I think some of that lingered into the 1990s, even though the paper had drastically changed in terms of its ownership, in terms of its Jewish identity, and it even lingers to today. So it's not quick or not even able often to recognize anti-Semitism.
Because you think mostly of a sort of a defensiveness, self-consciousness that it takes to the.
Right. People will say we're standing up for our own, and the New York Times tries to be just, without fear or favor and impartial.
Right. It overcorrects.
Yeah, overcorrects. That's a good way of putting it.
I'd like now to pause, and if guests have questions, yes, please step to the microphone that's right over here.
Hi, how are you? Thank you. David Margolin from Chabad.org. I don't know if you need that, but Commissioner Kelly. So I'm not exactly familiar when you were the precinct chief here, but kind of a general question is, during that time, I'm assuming it was in the 70s or 80s?
Say it again, I'm sorry.
When you were precinct chief at the 71st precinct, that was?
In the 80s.
In the 80s.
Yeah.
So my question is whether you saw just from that position, if you were able to see kind of just from the regular crime or the regular atmosphere in the neighborhood, were you able to predict that something was going to happen a few years later? Just reading, I did a lot of research now. Recently I wrote an article. I'll send you all a link. But reading an article by Dorothy Rabinowitz in 1978 in Commentary, and just her description of the political atmosphere surrounding Crown Heights in particular was one that I have the benefit of hindsight, but looking at what she was writing, it looks pretty clear that she's basically predicting that something, if allowed, an anti-Semitic riot would occur. So my question is,
it could have happened.
That she was already saying in 78 that it looks like that's the way it was heading. I was wondering whether that was something, and then particularly whether there's something that, there's police officers here. We're very thankful for their presence here, and just whether there are things that they can look out for in terms of what something could turn into.
Well, I think you're right. First of all, the precinct was bigger physically. It was before coterminality. So it had a lot more people in it. There were lots of sort of petty incidents, I'll call them. You had an integrated neighborhood, neighbor versus neighbor, that sort of thing. You had at least the perception of the Jewish community was that they were being victimized. And they actually put together what we would call a vigilante group. And the people who may remember him, Rabbi Shem Tov, was a famous guy here. I got along with him very well, but he headed that group, and he was arrested several times for things that he did. So that was sort of the environment. We had this vigilante group who would go on patrol, and it is a lot different than sort of the citizens patrol that we have now. We seem to have a lot of sort of neighbor-to-neighbor flare-ups. So, it certainly had the potential for something big happening. I don't think anybody obviously could foresee the cause of the the flare-up of the riot. But I would say this: there's been a presence of the NYPD in front of 770 Eastern Parkway for 40 years. That has caused friction, ebbing and flowing, in the African American community about that presence. And I'm sure probably still exists today to a certain extent. So those were the ingredients that were here. And quite frankly, I wasn't surprised when something broke out of the magnitude of the Crown Heights riot.
Something I've wondered is there were 180 plus people arrested during the riot. Do you have a sense of whether they went on to, was that a one-off in their lives of violence and criminality, or something that a lot of them then tended to be repeat offenders?
Most of the charges, of course, were low-level charges. As I said before, it was disorderly conduct, that sort of thing. We just wanted to get them off the street. Limerick Nelson, who stabbed Yankel Rosenbaum, he went to jail ultimately for 10 years. He admitted that he stabbed Yankel Rosenbaum that night. He had the knife, matching Yankel Rosenbaum's blood in his pocket.
And I believe Rosenbaum identified him before he died.
And he identified him. You're absolutely right. So he had 2 trials in which he was found or not guilty, basically. And then the 3rd trial was a federal trial, a civil rights violation, and he went to jail for 10 years. But it's interesting, he admitted stabbing Yankel Rosenbaum, to the police, and he admitted it at the 3rd trial. He just said, I did it not because he was Jewish. I was caught up in the moment. And so he's the only significant sentence, I guess, that came out of that, as far as I know.
Right. Yeah, I was just wondering whether you think people who get involved, all these young people who just got caught up in the moment, was it then something that sort of affected them for the rest of their lives, where that felt more like an acceptable behavior, or was it this insanity?
I would doubt it, because, as I say, generally speaking, the charges were low level.
So if you'll allow me, I'll ask 2 questions. Hopefully that's okay. So obviously we're 3 months after a particularly virulent rise of anti-Semitism in New York City. May was obviously very difficult. I think the ADL reported over 100% increase in anti-Semitic attacks. So I was wondering, and this is the 2 parts of my question, why was May so bad? Was it the perfect storm of deep policing, maybe some COVID angst, and then also the military conflict in Gaza? And then why did May trigger sort of this public consciousness to anti-Semitism in the United States, after we've really seen for the past decades or so, based off the FBI crime data, that anti-Semitism hasn't gone anywhere, and these attacks against Jewish people haven't gone anywhere. So why did May sort of spark that public consciousness, and why was May so bad in the city?
I'm not certain there's a clear answer. I think anti-Semitism ebbs and flows in this city and in other cities. It may have been, sometimes it's even a little bit of an initiation for a gang to do something along those lines. I don't know enough about the situation, but in my years of policing, I've seen it rise and fall, and to a certain extent, that's what I saw in Europe as well. So again, as I get back to what I said, I think it's illogical. I don't think it's a big reason for it. Maybe jealousy, maybe that's the only thing I can think about in the real world. But I can't give you a better answer than that.
Professor, so you have a lot of fondness, as we said, for the community here. Do you feel like the riot left a long-term imprint, and what is it? What changed, or not?
Well, it certainly left a big imprint on my life and on me and in my reporting. I covered the riots in '91, and a couple of years later, I left the New York Times to teach. I felt that there were a variety of reasons why I got to that stage in my career where I didn't want to be a daily reporter. But when I was a young reporter, I wanted to be a foreign correspondent and cover wars, but I never thought I'd cover one in Brooklyn. So that was maybe I fulfilled my dream to be a war correspondent, and then switched to teaching, which is a profession where I have not only could shape the next generation of journalists, but also have more perspective on what I did as a reporter. So that experience gave me some perspective on what happened when I was covering Crown Heights. In terms of how it shaped this neighborhood, I think that things are better. I don't feel the same tension that existed here 30 or more years ago. I don't think there's love and brotherhood on the streets, but I think there's more tolerance and a better mood, and for a lot of reasons. One reporter for The Forward made a great point, I thought, that this community, the Jewish community in Crown Heights, backed Eric Adams for mayor. And that was a sea change in a lot of ways for and I don't know if it was official or unofficial, or that's just, but this neighborhood definitely voted for Eric Adams and did not vote for David Dinkins. So something changed here, and maybe there's more confidence and maybe more a greater sense that they're in good hands with an African-American mayor.
Right. And maybe a sort of a strange confluence of caring about law and order right now and being more tolerant.
I just want to say that I still have contact with the Lubavitch community. I'm hopefully helping them build a security system. So I've asked this question, and I got an answer that the low point in this community was 30 years ago, the Crown Heights riots, that things have gotten better, that the relationships are stronger, that there is, as it was said, there's not great love and fellowship on the streets, but that communication is much better at the leadership level. So that if something does happen, they know who to call. They know, they're familiar with each other. They have regular meetings. So the potential for ending something that's violent is much greater than it was.
That's wonderful to hear. That's very uplifting. You both had a lot of focus on the importance of a one-to-one interaction in your work. How much of that was shaped by the riot? Where do you see that fitting in some way? In bridging and in understanding what's happening on the ground, this sort of community interaction?
Well, I think certainly Inspector Hayward and every precinct commander these days is expected to do a whole lot of communicating with members in the community. That's something that is fundamental to the job of precinct commander as you go up as well. So I think I did a lot of that. I would be in 770 maybe 3 times a week. I did meet the Rebbe and had relationships with a lot of folks here. When I was a commissioner, what I would do is walk along certain streets with like one security person, like 125th Street in Harlem. It would take me maybe an hour to walk 1 block, and I get tremendous feedback, face-to-face, real-world feedback. I do it on Fulton Street as well in Brooklyn. So, yeah, I think communication is the key. You got to keep talking. If something happens, you got to know who to talk to, and you got to do that as quickly as possible.
There's a real danger when journalists parachute into a place and become an instant expert and think they know what's going on in this country or that country, or this neighborhood or that neighborhood. And you just can't parachute in and figure it out. You've got to, like with, I guess, community policing, community journalism, you've got to learn the local customs and the local language and the local and what people are thinking and what they're eating and what their lives are like to really tell their story fully. Sometimes it's necessary to parachute in, but you also need people on the ground. And that's a trend in journalism. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, there were a newspaper like the New York Times had foreign correspondents all over the world, and they would just parachute in and tell you what's going on in Africa or in Asia. Now they use a lot more people who are locals, who know the area, who've lived there. Even correspondents stay longer. So for me personally, to have covered the riots after if not growing up here, but having very strong ties to the community, helped me tell the story better.
Right. And that seems like a very good trend to have more. Having lived through a riot, does it feel, is that something that you come back to in your work, in your lives?
Need to think about it?
Yeah. Such a violent situation.
Not too often, quite frankly.
Well, I guess you've both seen a lot of other things as well.
A few other things I've experienced too, so.
So you were in Haiti, so it kind of pales. Are there other questions?
Just maybe in a question form, to give you a couple of insights, and you can sort of maybe either agree or disagree. So I'm Eli Cohen, and I actually run the Crown Heights Jewish Community Council, and we're engaged a lot in this interaction between the various ethnic groups within the neighborhood. And we just actually had one Crown Heights, which was a whole day of festivities where it was completely across the neighborhood. It was in Brower Park and was very well attended, and we've been doing this on a regular basis over the last few years. And so I would suggest, and maybe you'll agree or disagree, but at the time in the 90s was still the very, very high crime period in New York that then went down in Giuliani and then Bloomberg. And that a lot of, you mentioned the community patrols, which were obviously apparently a necessity because of the high crime levels that existed, and that people were really, it's hard to trust a neighbor if you know that yesterday and the day before and the day before that somebody was attacked on the street, and there were, I think your article had about 10 murders in the course of 20 years of Jewish people in the neighborhood who were murdered, and of course many robbed and so on. I think as crime came down over those years, and you definitely had a good big part of that, Commissioner Kelly, the problem, let's say the atmosphere or the background, the backdrop of better community relations was created. So I would suggest that that's one factor that changed, that has made, and even though we have seen, a lot of, it wasn't just May. I mean, right before we went into COVID, there was a period of heightened tensions with a lot of incidents of anti-Semitic incidents. Then there was a couple of years before that. There were the knockout punch incidents. So we had that, the waves definitely came, and May, just because, obviously relating to issues taking place in Israel, it fled up again, but it wasn't anything new that we hadn't seen before. But the other issue, I think we have over here, one of our community affairs officers. I think the fact that so much effort was put into having community affairs officers in the neighborhoods who really understood the people. And there was one incident actually in 770 where we had a stabbing of a rabbinical student by someone not from the community, black, and he was shot and killed by the police in 770 about, I don't know if it's 8, 9 years ago, maybe 7. And the fact that community affairs officers and all these different connections that you spoke about, the leadership, were able to get together and respond to that incident, so that by the morning when people woke up and got the news, they already saw the video footage. They already the fact of having this all there, all in place, was able to diffuse a potential catastrophe before it happened. So again, I know that you put a lot of work into that, and clergy councils and community affairs officers, and the work that they do working with us and other leaders in other communities is essential to, and the question is, I mean, you can obviously comment, but I just wanted to add that into the mix.
No, but it's a very important element, and again, I'll refer to Inspector Hayward here. Your community affairs officers are worth their weight in gold. They have their ear to the ground. They have certain contacts. People feel more comfortable calling them than, say, perhaps calling the commanding officer, or easy to get through to. So I actually was a commander of 4 precincts, and I in every one they were invaluable to me. So yeah, kudos to them. It's
Officer Barada is here. He's the latest. He does exactly that, and there's been 2 before him in the last. Also, they last a lot longer than the CO gets transferred out after 5 years.
Yeah, right.
Or 2 years, or 3
He's
years.
like the furniture.
But these guys stay here for 10 or 15.
Been here 10 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
11.
I would say this, one thing different from 30 years ago is kosher sushi.
Is that an improvement?
we're going to see.
I would say, I just want to add that the community police officer is essential for the reporter. I'm sure reporters call you up all the time because you want to know what's going on. That's the person to talk to in the precinct. We value you as well.
So I just wanted to follow up.
Sure.
I think Ali was exactly right. Ali Cohen is exactly right that the let's say racial. I'm not sure that racial tensions was ever really what Crown Heights was about. There was the fact that Crown Heights was probably one of the only areas where Jews and blacks actually lived together, and therefore something can happen because it's not going to happen on the Upper East Side. But what is worrisome today, and this is something that perhaps you can both, Ari and Commissioner Kelly, can both speak to, is that exactly what Ellie was saying, that as crime rates in the city went down, so you have less to fear. So today, as a resident of Crown Heights, we're sitting in Maple Street, Shoal right here. 10, 15 years ago, a white chassid wouldn't walk to this block. You don't pass Lefferts, and because it's just dangerous. And the other way, I'll walk to Lincoln and St. John's and past it without any fears because I've lived here over the last 15 years and that's become normal. Speak to somebody of my in-laws generation, every time they see a mezuzah anywhere past Eastern Parkway, they go crazy. Like, wow, how is this possible? No one ever walked here even. So the fear now, I think, and I'm saying this as just a resident, is that last year when you had the lawlessness, which was taking, and there were no particularly anti-Semitic that in the neighborhood there were marches, there were things, they're walking down Eastern Parkway, but there was this general sense that there isn't that much, there's a level less control of the streets. So I don't know if this is a fact. I have been noticing less patrols, just walking patrols on the street. So there is that sense of like who's really going to be in control in the future, and I think with the media's part in this is, in New York, there is this idea of the Hasidic landlord, for example. There was, during COVID, masking, et cetera, like how Hasidim are, and that was coming from the governor, that was coming from the mayor, and that was being amplified by the media. So there's a lot of things, and kind of that type of anti-Semitism wasn't actually about blood libels or anything ancient. It was, particularly, I think, New York, this nefarious, I've been called a building owner or whatever, a landlord on the street. It's not, it's that sort of thing. And kind of that combination between the media using Chassidim as the other and the fact that there's this, and I think that the fact that Eric Adams was voted for actually speaks to the fact that it wasn't really about race. People voted against Dinkins or wanted Dinkins out because he allowed something here to happen. And Eric Adams is out of the field I think the idea was that he's somebody who is pro law enforcement. He's from there, and maybe this is our last hope in terms of, am I going to be able to walk to this block in 5 years from now? That's a question. So that's I think, yeah.
I just want to point out that in the last probably year and a half, you've had a significant number of retirements from the police department. You may have anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000. I think a number is kind of classified these days. So that may very well be why you don't see the patrols. But this is a problem, recruiting people and getting people to become police officers. It's a difficult time to be a cop, not only in New York but throughout the country. They've been demonized. It was a survey that showed, I think, 1,000 police officers, only 7% would recommend to their friends or family to come into the profession. So that is quite a statement. It's going to be a challenging time throughout the country for police departments, mostly in big cities. This is where the problem is to hire competent people to be police officers. Hopefully it'll all work out, but that's where we are right now.
We've reached our time, and I want to respect everyone's desire to have kosher sushi as soon as possible. Professor, do you want to say one last thing, or is there anything that sparked you from that particular question?
I'm thinking about what David said about the neighborhood and the way it's changed, and the ability just to feel free here and to feel safe. That's a huge change as a New Yorker. Having lived here some pretty dark times, and that the police have done an amazing job in making this city more livable. I mean, in Brooklyn, in Manhattan, where I live, there were parts that I wouldn't go, and now I have almost no fear. So I think the press could do a much better job in covering the police, and I think they deserve a lot better coverage and praise, and I hope that's something that we could focus on as well.
What a good note to end on. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming in a hurricane, and especially our two guests. If you'd like to find out more about the Manhattan Institute and our Policing and Public Safety Initiative, please visit our website and read our material, sign up for our newsletter. And thank you, and I hope everyone stays around a little to speak afterward.